to the weather in crop income. And I mentioned, we talked about runs on banks, right, with the Panic of 1837. FDR, this is for next semester, but FDR's New Deal would help address some of these concerns, in part by creating the FDIC that protected the banking industry. Well, part of FDR's New Deal was also creating securities for farmers, right? Protecting farmers, because it is such a risky, necessary but risky business. And cotton planters in antebellum America obviously didn't benefit from these protections that wouldn't come until the next century, right? So a lot of money to be made from planting cotton, but a lot of risk involved. You could lose your land, your farm, your home. You could lose your slaves, which were considered as property. You're in debt to the bank. You don't pay. You miss payments. That property can be reclaimed, leaving you without the means to make more money. Even the wealthiest of families were at risk of being destitute. So the more wealth one gained, the more land they needed to procure, which led to more enslaved laborers, more credit, and more mouths to feed. It was a cycle. And in the decades before the Civil War, we mentioned this before. I said that the antebellum South did not isolate itself from the rest of the world, right? They connected with the world, with Europe, with Asia, in terms of communication, production of cotton, and through the markets, through trade. Well, the antebellum South likewise was not a time of slow and simple tradition. It wasn't a time of moonshine and magnolias, right? It was a time of high competition, high risks, where their entire livelihood rested on the whims of pests and weather. But it also came with high reward. So slavery, profit, and cotton did not exist only in the rural South. As we mentioned before, some of the cities in the South, and we've named several of these, doubled and even tripled in size, including New Orleans, Louisiana. Cities served as hubs of a global market where planters could ship their produce, their product, right, their cotton, to a city where it could then be shipped somewhere nationally, such as New York, or even internationally, to Britain, Portugal, Cuba. So the 1830s, 40s, and 50s saw an extraordinary spike in the growth of the South. For nearly half a century after the Revolution, the South, remember I told you that the South, during the antebellum era, so from the 1830s through the 50s into going up into 1861, this region is largely developed in an explosive growth during this time, right? Before the 1830s, so for about a half a century after the American Revolution, the South was a very small region. It consisted of small towns, county seats, and a few plantations. They were connected by a few roads, but also by rivers, streams, and lakes. So New Orleans, as an example, in 1820 had a population of 27,000 people. 40 years later, in 1860, that 27,000 person population had exploded to 168,000. Cities certainly existed before, right, in the years following Revolution, but they served as local ports rather than regional, national, or international hubs. And that changed with the Cotton Revolution. Before cotton, the South had few ports. International travel and supply was difficult, especially on the waters of the Mississippi River, which was the main artery of the United States, of the North American continent. But this changed in part because of the market revolution, right, which allowed for the Cotton Revolution and the transportation revolution. What's an example of a technology that facilitated the transportation revolution and the Cotton Revolution? The steamboat. And this is what we're looking at here is a reconstruction of an early steamboat called the New Orleans. Was built in January 1812 as a 371-ton ship called the New Orleans. Note it is italicized. If you see New Orleans as an identification on the exam and it's in italics, it's not referring to the city, it's referring to the ship. In 1812, it arrived at its namesake city. So it arrived in New Orleans in 1812. It had sailed from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It was the first steamboat to navigate the internal waterways of the North American continent from one end to the other and able to return home, right, against the flow of river under the power of its steam engine. The technology wasn't perfect. It was a huge step forward. For example, the New Orleans, 2 years later in 1814, it sank after hitting a sandbar which was submerged under the water. But it promised a bright future. How bright of a future? Just 5 years after the New Orleans arrived, so about 1817, 17 steamboats ran regular routes up and down river lines. By the 1840s, more than 700 steamboats. So the market revolution, right, led to the transportation revolution and technological developments such as the steamboat. Well, these steamboats, this technological revolution, facilitated the Cotton Revolution of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. So beginning in 1812 with this first steamboat, the New Orleans, you get 17 5 years later. By the mid-1840s, right in the center of the Cotton Revolution, you now have 700 steamboats. This is significant. Why? This helps power the Cotton Revolution. This enables planters to get their cotton from some distant location to a city, a hub, an international hub, such as New Orleans, where their cotton can then be transported nationally and even internationally. These boats carried 160,000 tons of raw product, which converted into nearly $220 million in trade in a single year. And more than 80% of the trade that was made from steamboats was related to just cotton oil, not other products. So economic growth, violence, exploitation coexisted and mutually reinforced evangelical Christianity in the South. By 1860, the vast majority of Southerners who identified with any particular religious denomination were either Baptist or Methodist. And originally, in the early 19th century, most Christian denominations attacked attacked slavery as an evil, right? And I mentioned before, just a few moments ago, during the antebellum era, or before the antebellum era, Southerners, how did they defended Christianity? I mean, they defended slavery, but how did they defend slavery before the antebellum era?
Undeniable evil.
A necessary evil, right? They felt it was an evil thing, but it was necessary, right? But during the antebellum era, how did they defend slavery?
A necessary good.
An undeniable good. Yeah. So evangelical Christianity was in line with this line of thinking. In the early 19th century, they actually attacked slavery as an evil, but during the antebellum era, evangelical Christians became some of the most vocal defenders of slavery and the social Southern order. Southern ministers, yes, ma'am. I'm like, I don't know this person.
I recognize the color.
Okay. Oh, okay, interesting. So Southern ministers argued that God himself had selected Africans for bondage, but they considered at the same time, ironically, yes, they considered enslaved people, the salvation or evangelization of enslaved people to be one of their greatest callings. Here's a good example of irony, right? And since you're so shocked, I'll explain. We have a few minutes left, so. Are you familiar with Ham, Japheth, and I think it's Shem in the Judeo-Christian literature? Islam shares a lot of the early literature, and this but definitely in the Judeo-Christian literature. You're familiar with I was like, I haven't even said it yet. But you're familiar with the story of Noah?
Yeah.
Right? And after the flood waters rescinded, Noah, do you know what he did? He got drunk. Are you familiar with that? All right, so he got drunk. Most people don't talk about that aspect of the story, but Noah got drunk, and he had 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. This is an origin story for racial difference in the world, right? It's not true, but I'm not attacking the Bible. I'm just saying, like, people that came later used Ham, Shem, and Japheth to justify racial distinctions between human beings. Japheth became the European, according to these advocates of scientific racism. Shem became Asian, and Ham became African. And the reason they argue that or the way that the justification emerges for Africans being chosen for bondage is because when Noah got drunk, he ended up disrobed. He didn't have any clothes on. And Ham found him, and he thought it was funny. And Ham went and got Japheth, and Shem was like, come check this out, Dad. He's drunk, and he doesn't have any clothes on, right? And Japheth and Shem take a blanket or a coat, and they walk up backwards to their dad and cover him without mocking him, right? And Ham, because of that, was allegedly cursed. And that curse then, the curse of Ham, for some advocates of racial difference and scientific racism, blame Ham for the bondage of African peoples, which is what Southern ministers were doing in the antebellum era. That's why they argued God had selected Africans for bondage, going back to the curse of Ham with the story of Noah when he was drunk, passed out, and disrobed, and Ham made fun of him. Enslaved people typically received instruction from their white preachers or their enslavers. This is a screenshot I took from a really good movie. Do you recognize it? Okay. 12 Years a Slave. I don't know if you've heard of 12 Years a Slave. It's way too long to show you in class, but it's about a northern free black man by the name of Solomon Northup, who was free. He was he lived in New York, he had a family, he was a musician, and he went to do a show in Washington, D.C., where two dubious characters put something in his drink that made him pass out, and they sold him to slavers because at the time there was a slave market in Washington, D.C., and from there he was kidnapped, right? He was taken to the South. He ended up in Louisiana, and he lived for 12 years as a slave before he was able to get a letter sent back to his family and to a friend who could send someone to Louisiana, prove that he was free, and bring him back north. He wrote his memoir. It's called 12 Years a Slave. It's a book. It's a free book online. You can read it. And it was recently, I say recently, it's probably more than 10 years ago now, turned into a movie. And this scene is one of his enslavers who is reading on Sunday from the Bible, but they made selective references, right? They tended to ignore the story of Exodus. They didn't want to tell their slaves about the Hebrew slaves running away, breaking free from their bondage, right? They didn't want to put those kind of stories in their mind. So they were selective readings that they would share with their slaves. These messages typically stress the subservience, the obedience of enslaved people. And anti-literacy laws in the South meant that most slaves couldn't read the Bible. That would end up contrasting this message given by their masters or white preachers. If you get a chance, Roll Jordan, Roll, The World the Slaves Made by Eugene Genovese. It's a good book, and it's one of the first ones. It's like from the 70s. It's an old book. But it's one of the first histories devoted to, that centered the perspective on enslaved people themselves. So, due to this perspective of their enslavers and white preachers and anti-literacy laws, the significance is that most slaves couldn't learn of inspirational stories such as Moses leading out the Hebrew slaves out of Egypt. Yet contradiction between God's word, right, the Bible, and the cruelty of their enslavers did not escape the notice of enslaved people. As one former enslaved person, Williams Wells Brown, declared, quote, "Slaveholders hide themselves behind the church. A more praying, preaching, song-singing people cannot be found than the slaveholders of the South," end quote. Many slave people created and they practiced their own versions of Christianity, which typically incorporated aspects from African religions with limited input from the white community. One such leader or slave person who was inspired by religion, Nat Turner, Nat Turner became the leader of the greatest slave rebellion in the South. By greatest, I just mean largest slave rebellion in the South. And he found religion or religious inspiration from his early years. He lived an austere Christian life from his adolescence. He claimed to have been visited by spirits when he was in his 20s, and he thought of himself as a prophet of God. He said he had visions in which he was called on to do the work of God, which leads some historians to question his sanity, the fact that he's having visions. But inspired by his faith, on August 22nd, 1831, Nat Turner led the most deadly slave rebellion in the antebellum South. This took place in Virginia in Southampton County. He had 6 collaborators, and they attempted to free the region's enslaved people. He began this rebellion by killing his owner with an axe blow to the head. They killed 57 white men, women, and children on 11 different farms. By the next day, the local militia and white residents had captured or killed every single participant except for Turner, who hid by in the woods for the next few weeks before he was eventually captured and executed. So what is the significance of Nat Turner's rebellion? Well, it transformed Southern religion. And anti-literacy laws increased. Black-led churches, the ones that existed, were broken up. No more black-led churches. And they were placed under the supervision of white ministers. So, again, 2 significances of Nat Turner's rebellion. Mauricio, you okay? All right. Was that anti-literacy laws increased. Why? To prevent future rebellions. And 2, the few black-led churches that were in existence were broken up. Christian, you okay? 7:15 is an early class. All right, so let's see. Evangelical religion not only shaped slavery in the antebellum South, it also shaped what is known as an honor culture for Southern men and women. Southern manhood was largely shaped by an obsession with masculine honor, whereas Southern womanhood centered on expectations of sexual virtue and purity. Honor prioritized the public recognition of white masculine claims to reputation and authority, and Southern men developed a code to ritualize their interactions with each other and to perform their expectations of honor. This code of language and behavior was designed to minimize conflict. But when conflict did arise, the code provided rituals to reduce the resulting violence. The best example of the code in conduct is the duel. So this is actually an image of Alexander Hamilton being shot by Aaron Burr. Right? There's not a lot of images out there of duelers. So if 2 men couldn't settle a dispute through the arbitration of their friends, they would exchange pistol shots to prove their equal honor status. States and territories actually had laws against dueling. Even when Alexander Hamilton was shot, they had to leave New York to go to an island where they would not be breaking the law. But when upper class Southerners were prosecuted in the antebellum era, rare, but when it happened, they were often acquitted the juries often acquitted the accused. So despite the fact that hundreds of duelists fought and killed each other, there's little evidence that many duelists faced prosecution, and only one person was actually executed for a duel. And this happened in 1809. The guy's name was Timothy Bennett of Illinois, actually. So not even in the South, but in Illinois. The guy was executed. But the thing with Timothy Bennett, who killed Alfonso Converse Stewart, this was it was supposed to be a mock duel, and they were in an argument over, I think it was a cow getting in his neighbor's garden or in his crops, and this led to a mock duel, and their guns were supposed to be empty, but Timothy Bennett secretly put ammunition in his gun, and when they turned and fired, he ended up killing Stewart. So the only person who was actually prosecuted and executed for dueling. He escaped initially, but he was eventually hunted down and prosecuted for his crime. So the South's honor culture affected women as well. White Southern men sought to maintain their masculinity, and while Southern women cultivated a sense of femininity. And Southern femininity was intimately tied to the domestic sphere, that is the home, more so than women in the North were. And this strictly limited wealthy women's public life. So while Northern women in the 19th century became involved with and manage the household. Female virtue largely came to be understood. We have just a couple minutes. Female virtue came to be understood as a euphemism for sexual purity, and Southern culture, Southern law, and Southern violence largely centered on protecting that virtue of sexual purity from any possible imagined threat. So in a world saturated with sexual exploitation of black women, Southerners developed a paranoid obsession with protecting the sexual purity of white women, when black men were presented as an insatiable sexual threat. So racial systems of violence and domination wielded together with crushing intensity for decades, all in the name of keeping white womanhood as pure as the cotton that anchored together white society. So let's see, we have about a minute left. That is it for the Cotton Revolution. When we return on Thursday, we'll talk about Manifest Destiny. And when is your topic? Your digital timeline?